Welcome to the Arena Decklist Podcast. I'm Jerry Thompson, joined by Brian Gottlieb. I just woke up from a nap.
As one does.
Yeah, as one does at 3 p.m. I did not sleep well last night for some reason. I was very, very tired, but just like couldn't get to sleep, And then I just got to the point where I was exhausted, but couldn't fall asleep and just in a bad mood. So took a little nap. That tends to cure things. I feel okay now, but a little sleepy. And you're, I guess, hopped up on painkillers.
Yeah, just the way you like to do these shows. Yeah, having a bit of a shoulder issue today, which flares up from time to time. So maybe not 100% optimal Brian, but let's be honest. I don't know that 100% optimal Brian has showed up to the podcast in quite some time. So it should just be business as usual.
Maybe painkiller Brian is just exactly
maybe
what
this is what the doctor ordered. Yeah.
So this one's going to be interesting because I don't know. We're not really talking about like Magic the cards, I guess, so much because last weekend there was a Pro Tour in Minneapolis that was standard, first big standard event outside of the RCs in quite some time, and I think it was either right before top four or the finals. They did this sort of surprise announcement that basically just meant that, well, I don't want to say it meant this, but like what they tried to convey was that they were going to like refocus their efforts on making standard like a playable and I don't know, trying to get back to be a popular format and whatnot. And I thought that was interesting. If what they say is true, the dedication is there and they have a good plan in place, I think that this is good news. The thing that struck me as somewhat strange with it is I know that that's normally when they do those sorts of announcements, but the timing is just weird to me because if what they wanted to do was in this instance, standard is going to be 3 years worth of sets instead of 2, which means that they're not rotating. I feel like if they announced that before the Pro Tour, people would be more interested in the Pro Tour, right?
Oh, good point, Gerald. I hadn't considered that, but I agree with you. That makes a lot of sense to me.
So that was kind of weird to me, but I don't know, like, because they sat down and they had that announcement and I was like, oh, like this actually matters a lot more. Like this tournament matters a lot more than it did 5 minutes ago or whatever. And then I was just like, why are they doing this now? Like, granted, the numbers for the event were not bad.
Yeah.
And it wasn't one of those very suspicious looking spikes where it's like, okay, this seems like there's some sort of view botting going on or whatever. Like it did seem authentic, right? So,
It did. And I thought it was a pretty nice production. I mean, you're certainly on my end bolstered by the fact that some people I really like were participating in the top 8. That will always get my viewership. And I had some horses to root for. Yeah.
Kane.
Autumn as well, of course.
No, of course.
Always a fan of Autumn, but they both put on some really excellent performances. And for Kane, kind of like a breakthrough performance, right? I remember telling them just years ago, whatever you want to do in Magic, you will be able to do. And this was after Kane had a really unfortunate scenario at a Pro Tour years ago where actually slept through day 2 through really no fault of their own. And, was down. And I was just like, you will do whatever you need to do in this game. You will be great. I'm sorry, I know this is hard, but I'm confident you're going to do great things. And to see Kane finally deliver on it, really, really awesome.
Yeah, agreed. Sometimes it just takes time, Yeah. And
I thought about that a lot this weekend, actually, like how many narratives, like even someone like Nathan, who is now on one of the most dominant runs in Magic history, like legitimately rivaling Kai, which I didn't think is something I would ever say again, especially with the texture of the modern game. I just didn't know that those edges were actually available to that extent. And he was probably great for a very long time. Like, I know he's young and I know his skills have rapidly expanded, but just if things had broken a few different ways, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, this could just be an ongoing thing where Nathan had been a dominant fixture for a very long time. And it is kind of funny how these things happen in Magic.
Nathan is what, 18, 19?
I mean, incredibly unfathomably young for someone like me.
Right. And
I also wait. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but at some point, people were casting the finals as Boomer versus Zoomer, and if Kane's a Boomer, I am just fucked. Like I am literally
I'm a corpse.
dust.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just so because Kane doesn't even look old.
No, Kane isn't old. Kane is very young.
Anyway, what I was getting to with the youngness aspect of it is some of that success has come from qualifying online, I believe, which they still have the stuff in place where, like, if you're a minor, you can't qualify for things.
Very true.
So
Very true.
that could be part of it too, where, I mean, I know that a lot of, like, certainly Nathan was at almost every single Grand Prix, it seemed like, for years that I went to. And it's not like he was taking a break when he was at home or whatever. Like, as far as I know, he was still playing Magic Online and everything. So
yeah, fixture at Magic Online for sure.
If half the way that you engage with Magic you can't qualify off of, like, yeah, I mean, that's probably why this took so long. It was probably a small part of it, at least.
Fair enough, yeah.
But also now has like a very talented team to work with as well.
Mm-hmm. That always helps.
Yeah, in the case of Autumn, obviously we love Autumn on the cast, but Autumn has previously won a Pro Tour. So
yeah.
At that point, it's just like, you made top 8 and we're happy for you, but also we're not surprised. You know, like we know exactly how good you are. And like, if you keep showing up, yeah, eventually you're going to do well again. So it being Kane's first one, I was super happy to see.
Same.
But yeah, the plan, as they have outlined, there's like this very, very small article. I'm surprised that it's like this short on... I went to dailymtg.com, which redirected me to a different website.
Yeah, not a real site, but we got there eventually.
magic.wizards.com/en/news. That's something. So, okay. Where to start with this? We'll be rolling out multifaceted plans over the coming months. Today is step 1. That step is that we're going to extend the life cycle of all cards in Standard by 1 year, starting with the current Standard environment. Sets will rotate out every 3 years rather than every 2 years.
This is very funny, given our cast last week, which got released late, by the way. It came out on, I don't know, maybe Tuesday. So just a couple days before we're recording this. And so we were actually heavily talking about, what's supposed to happen with Standard. We're about to do a rotation, the ubiquity of cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Bankbuster. And so we ended up putting out this incredibly out of touch, out of date podcast, which is very funny to me, actually. But now it gets to function as kind of a time capsule.
Yeah. Normally you dig those up after like 10, 20 years, but
no, just the next day.
Article goes on to say, extending Standard will give current Standard cards more longevity, will allow mechanics and archetypes to be more effectively built on over time, and it gives us stronger tools to create an environment where decks are more colors and mechanic, like green-white toxic or blue-white soldiers, and less mid-range. We believe this will give Standard more stability, more vitality, and strengthen it for local game stores. Man, where do you want to start, Brian?
All right. I think as a threshold matter, I need to say that I think this is a good call. I think on the whole, this is very, very important for the long-term health of Magic. I think this is something I've personally missed a lot. And when I say this, I mean Standard mattering. Just the goal here is something I've missed a lot.
Yeah.
So good goal, great goal. Where I start to question a little bit of how this is presented is in the explanation of how it's going to be achieved, what they view as the actual problem with Standard. And I also feel like a lot of what's being said here is sort of in contravention of the past. Like it ignores a lot of how Standard was successful before. And so I guess I could take it like point by point of those 3 bullet points you mentioned. We'll start with the first one. This will give current Standard cards more longevity.
Technically
Obviously.
true.
Obviously, there's nothing to dispute there. And I do think this is really important. I think the appetite for a game that is so quickly rotational and cards that are just, 0 to 60 in terms of their value and then 60 to 0 just as fast, I don't think that exists anymore. I think that it actually is a problem that has dried up. It was something that we accepted kind of by inertia. And then once that broke, it was never going to come back. Nobody was ever going to cling to the idea of, oh, I buy my standard cards every single set release, then they're gone in 2 years. And that's just how Magic is. And I deal with it because there's all these events that I like to play.
Yeah. And I mean, first, Modern existed basically because Eric Lauer had a dream that your standard cards would have a place to be played once they rotated.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually Modern
that didn't work.
Yeah, Modern got way too powerful to the point where basically no standard cards were making it in. Now, things are a little bit different because the standard cards are a lot more powerful, but it still doesn't really solve the issue. And as someone who spent probably like a decade maintaining a very strong collection for, standard, modern, etc., like I had a box of like standard cards and then a box of modern stuff and then a box of maybe stuff, right?
Yep.
And as soon as the stuff was out of standard, it basically went in the trash, like the vast majority of it all the time. So that didn't work. And then Pioneer came along, and for a little bit that format was kind of the same, where, all right, some stuff shows up here and there. And now I think, again, we're sort of back to a point where Pioneer consists of a lot of standard cards, actually. And a lot of the sets, which I think is honestly great, is that like a lot of them have more and more shots that do actually make it into Pioneer. So that's cool. But I also just don't think that that's like a very realistic goal. It's like the standard cards, just on the whole, if your deck rotates, you're still losing like 90-95% of the value, and it's not enough. Like maybe like some of your dual lands carry over or something, but even then it is definitely not enough for that goal to realistically exist.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I agree with everything you're putting forth there. I think too, one of the interesting things about wanting to give standard cards more longevity, I don't know that you were supposed to do it at the expense of rotations. I think rotations are net positive for standard. I was always on record saying I wanted more rotations, not fewer rotations. I would have loved to see 3 years with a 1 in, 1 out. And what that actually does is it means every set gets exactly 3 years, which is advancing this goal of giving standard cards more longevity, while simultaneously preserving that fresh feel, which is so critical, I think, for a standard environment and is the way you get people to be interested. Like, people do not want to play Rakdos Mirrors for 3 years. They just don't. That cannot be what standard looks like. And I'm going to talk more about like how I see them dealing with that, what the approach should be. But I do think step one should have been more rotations, not the same number of rotations, just spaced out over a larger time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, that is how most digital card games do it, which is, I don't know, it is a lot to track, It's just like every time a set comes out, then you have to like pay attention to like what's also leaving and whatever. But like the digital clients just do it automatically for you, right? If you're trying to build a standard deck or something, it just won't show you illegal cards, right? You don't have to think about it. You just build from what you have.
And you just have to accept the reality of how decks are built these days. Like, they're all built via Scryfall or a similar tool. Like, you're just always going to have that available to you, and that confusion. There's just such a tremendous level of buy-in at this point to actually understand Magic and what is legal and what isn't, that minimizing churn to try and create consistency and understanding, it's not doing the job. It can't do the job. You're asking it to carry such a tremendous weight. And I think if that was the reason not to go with more rotations, it was a real misstep.
Yeah. And maybe it's like less of a burden on us, like on the players, than it is on the developers. to just like minimize those rotations, right?
I don't know about that. I think a lot of that I would have to know more about the internal processes at Wizards to say whether that's true or not.
Well, as someone who kept 30 physical decks on my desk at any given time, if every time a new set entered FFL, I had to then go and update all of those decks, that would be kind of a pain in the ass. Just having to do things manually is not that great.
That I can 100% relate to. So yes, I will give you that one. And maybe that is the reason. And I do think that is a valid reason, by the way, if it is. Like, you have to be conscious of development resources. You really, really do. You have to think about that a lot. And I actually think that's where a lot of this decision stems from, is trying to give developers some more tools, some more options. And so if you told me that was the reason, great, I understand. And that kind of goes back to this messaging too. Is just like, I still don't trust everything that Wizard says to me. Like, I don't think they tell me the whole story. And if that was the reason, I don't have confidence that they would actually put that forth as the reason.
I agree.
I wish they would, though. Like,
yeah, same.
That's the type of communication I do want. But
man, I could go down that rabbit hole. I will just say that I believe there is a world in which they can retake the narrative on that stuff, and instead they choose to be silent. And I think that that's a missed opportunity. And I know that that is not necessarily how some of the folks on the inside feel. Like, they feel like the more information they share, the more chances it gives people to like basically attack them on Twitter. And obviously they want to do everything in their power to just not have that happen, because that sucks.
It does suck. But I was literally having a conversation very much rooted in this the other day in my job, and I'm going to try and think of how to relay the story without getting into specifics. Basically, there was something we were debating doing, and doing this thing sort of signified to the player base that we had a very high level understanding of what was going on. But we're choosing to make like an informed decision and not an uninformed decision.
Yeah.
However, giving this information would have given a lot of clues to the player base of like some of the other things we view as powerful, I guess is the cleanest way to say it. And that meant the exact consequence of making this statement was basically to make ourselves look smart. That's all it did, is just like assure people that we know what's going on. And the reality is, for the health of the game, we were just supposed to take the L in that spot. Like, we're just supposed to look a little stupid if things go wrong and be like, explain after the fact. And then there'll always be people who are like, oh, idiots, they don't know what they're talking about, they missed this. But like, sometimes you just have to look a little silly, and that's fine. And you don't make decisions that hurt the health of the game just to make yourself, have an easier time dealing with social media. I think it's just a path that you can't win on anyway. So why actually make your communication and your game worse by doing so?
Yeah.
It was a really interesting spot. I wish I could give more context for it, but I'd probably give away too much info if I did.
No, yeah, that's all good. I think that this is kind of like veering off topic real quick, but I do want to slide this in here before we get too far down the rabbit hole. But like, I do think that standard is important, mostly just because Magic needs a lower buy-in way to actually engage with the game, right? Like, it can't all just be Modern and Pioneer where decks are like $300+, right? And maybe that's being generous. That's on the low end.
Yep.
I actually don't know what the average Pioneer deck price is these days, but now I'm kind of curious.
Well, do you think, though, I think what you mean to say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you mean to say there needs to be a way to engage with the competitive game more cheaply? Because there are ways to engage with the broader game, like the ways you engage with the broader game cheaply.
Yes,
are like commander precons and things like that. The
competitive aspect for sure, because I mean that's what we're talking about, right? Yeah. If you had a group of friends that you wanted to play commander with, proxy your shit, You know, basically everyone is accepting of that at this point. If you don't want to spend like hundreds of dollars on cards or whatever, like you don't have to.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree more. Just not necessary. Yeah, but from an idea of there needs to be a lower stakes buy-in to the competitive scene, if you believe like the Pro Tour and, you know, that aspirational play model is critical to the long-term growth of your game, then yeah, you have to have a funnel to get people involved in that. And it certainly needs to look something like Standard.
Yeah, but the thing was, is over time, Standard ends up being way more expensive than something like Pioneer or Modern if you only maintained like one or two decks in those formats, right? Because it's just every rotation, you end up spending like another $300 to acquire a deck or whatever. And like, God forbid you ever want to change decks.
Yeah, I know that there's like when there was a very highly competitive Standard scene, there were kind of like rotational purchase players, which I think was actually a huge part of game store strategy, at least around me, the way our game stores worked before Commander popped up, was just like there's this entire group of players who couldn't afford to keep a full Standard collection. So basically they'd buy a Standard deck, then they'd sell you back a bunch of pieces of that Standard deck, buy another Standard deck, sell you a bunch of pieces of that, and just constantly keep this rotation going over and over. And it made a lot of churn in single stock for these stores.
Right. And
that I don't think they get to do anymore.
Yeah, it is very rare that someone is just like wholesale buying a brand new deck. You know, it's like usually they have something else to trade in or whatever, but like just something that keeps it a little bit on the cheaper end. And like, okay, so looking at Pioneer decks now, a lot of the top decks are like 400 to 600, but there are things like Lotus Field that's like 300. The monocolored aggro decks are like 200. So like that's not bad, but you know, average Pioneer deck being like high 400s, low 500s is a lot, right? And there needs to be a slightly cheaper way to do that if you just want to like, you know, play Magic for 6 to 12 months or something. It's like, I got the itch. I want to get back into this. Maybe you have like some friends that are going to some events that are coming up or whatever. It's like, it can't all be just like a $500 buy-in. It's just too much. So
yep.
I think the Standard is important for that. And yeah, just I don't know, like not everyone's a lifer, you know. It's certainly a lot of people are, but not everyone. And it can't all just be Modern and Pioneer, unfortunately, because there's also a barrier to entry as far as like format knowledge and just the fact that like there's so many cards in each of those formats.
Yeah, I think also like the opportunity for creativity is a huge boon with a good, healthy Standard format. Like so much of my joy that I ever derived from Magic, brewing new Standard decks, trying to break formats. And, you know, like folks like Aspiring Spike very much prove this theory wrong, but you kind of can't do that in Modern. Like, or you can, but 99.9% of what you do is going to ultimately be a failure. And you don't get many successes because the power level is so high. And if you turn your back exactly on sort of the primary method of interaction or the primary axis on which decks exist, you just get blown out of the water so quickly. Standard, you can get away with that if the power level's low enough, though.
Yeah.
And I think that is a huge part of what has been missing from my personal Magic experience for a long time now.
Man, the funny thing about this is, like, yes, technically Standard cards will have more longevity, right? You'll be able to play with your cards for almost 3 years in a lot of instances. But realistically, the kind of stuff that you're talking about too tends to lend itself more to formats that, you know, you're basically saying like a wider card pool, right? It's like more toys to play with, more potential like ideas to exist in everything. And I think I would argue that like these Standard formats, I mean, I'm going to say this, but then I'm going to maybe just automatically refute my point. But it's like there are more playable cards these days than there were 5 years ago, right? So in a way already, like Standard now has a wider card pool to draw from than it did back then.
It absolutely does. The problem is the apex of Standard is so high, and that's where so much of it gets pushed out.
It doesn't have to be in theory, right?
No,
and okay, so a lot of this announcement is met with a lot of trepidation because it's like, okay, 60, whatever, 5% of the Pro Tour played Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Like, and now you're saying that it's not actually going to rotate like we thought it was. Like, clearly this has to come with another announcement, right? Like some sort of like B&R. And I do have faith that will happen.
Yeah, so give me one moment. I want to find something I saw in our Discord today. I guess there was a chat over on the official Magic Discord, and some folks pulled quotes from it. And here's a quote from Andrew B. I feel like that's our buddy Andrew Brown. I would assume so. And it says, yes, we are going to update how and when bans happen. We want to be as clear and transparent with the community on when and why things are happening. So I think that sort of answers that question, that these things are on the radar. And it's good of Andrew to recognize that, like, there isn't the level of clarity and transparency there needs to be around these things. And hopefully that gets built in as part of this announcement.
And clearly there is some expectation of like, okay, what are you going to do about Fable, right? Because when you're looking at, oh, what sort of mid-range thing can I do? What sort of multicolored thing can I do? What sort of like 3-drops should I include in my deck? Like, how should my red deck be built? It's just like Fable kind of answers a lot of those questions, right? And it effectively sits on top of so much stuff that is in similar design space because it is just the best thing you can be doing in that slot. And that just informs a lot of your decisions, right? So you are right that the Apex stuff does invalidate a lot of the other like technically playable cards that do exist in the format, to the point where the format feels smaller than what it actually is. So if they address that stuff, and if things like Fable happen either less often or they're more willing to ban stuff like that, which I think is fine because you kind of got to this earlier, but like standard doesn't necessarily influence the secondary market of things anymore, right? So it is very rare when there's a card like Fable that is upwards of $30 that it is being driven by standard prices. And if you ban my Fables, which I semi-recently just purchased, like within the last couple months, like who cares? Because I still have them for Modern, Pioneer, whatever.
Yep. It should not affect the price whatsoever at this point.
And if you are a standard player and you have access to a reasonable collection, it's not like it just, Rakdos will still be a thing, right? There are still plenty of viable reasons to play black and red cards together. It's not just Fable. But in theory, that does unlock more of your collection to actually be playable and have value as well. So,
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we're starting to get to the point of these next 2 bullet points. And I do think we can sort of mush them together. And I'll give my preface now. This is probably where I get pretty negative and skeptical around this announcement. So you may feel free to bounce if that's not your thing. But the next 2 bullet points. It will allow mechanics and archetypes to be more effectively built on over time. As we moved away from the block model, we gained a lot of flexibility, but we also lost some ability to build on mechanics and themes within a set. With a longer window, we can find more opportunities to build up or revitalize archetypes. Coupled with the point above, that can lead to more diversity, longer lasting archetypes, and enough competitive churn to keep players engaged. And I'm just going to hit the second point as well. It also gives us stronger tools to create an environment where decks are more colors and mechanic, like green-white toxic or blue-white soldiers, and less mid-range. With a larger card pool, the format can handle bigger swings with entire decks seeded at once.
Can I nitpick real quick?
Please do.
Color plus mechanic, and then they name blue-white soldiers. The blue-white color pair for March of the Machine is Knights. And there's like, I don't know, 5 cards that do things relating to Knights. It's like, that's not a mechanic.
No, it's not. Good nitpicking. I approve.
In this instance, like, tribal constructed deck, that rules, right? But just it's just one of those things where I was like trying to figure out what the archetypes were without reading anything, right? Just from like going over the card list. And I was like, I don't get it, because there's very few cards, especially at lower rarity, that actually like mention like, oh, if you have knights, do X or whatever. And to the point where it was like, I didn't even realize that some of the things like were knights or were not knights because it just wasn't on my radar as a thing that I needed to pay attention to.
Yeah, not something you needed to care about. Sure.
So I was just like, what? I don't know what the hell happened there, but they're like the ASFAN for Knight Matter stuff, like the blue-white mechanic, it almost non-existent. It's wild. Anyway.
All right. So these 2 points, I think they're mostly bullshit. There is something to the idea of like allowing mechanics and archetypes to be more effectively built over time. Kind of like the development timing is such where like you'll see the first application of these cards in standard, but like basically just as you're probably designing the ones that'll be on the tail end of standard, if I were to guess my timelines appropriately.
It's basically a year of lead time, right? So if something comes out in set 4 and then gets released, by the time you can start addressing that will be like set 8 by the time stuff rotates. By the time that you see it like actually in the wild and can determine whether or not like, oh, that didn't hit as well as we thought it did. It kind of like needs this effect. We overlooked it. We would really love to put something in the next set. Well, by that time, like your thing is going to rotate out.
Yeah, I also like agree with you on the dev side. I don't know if that is the same on the design side though. Like I don't know how much further design works in advance than dev does.
Yeah, but if you're talking about like seeding decks for constructed, design doesn't care about that.
Shouldn't they? I mean, I guess I don't. Again, I don't know enough about how things work on the wizard side, so maybe
they're just trying to make dope magic cards, But it's like whether or not something's like a 4-mana 2/2 or a 2-mana 2/2, and is therefore like able to play pretty well in competitive standard or pioneer or whatever. It's like that's not a decision they make.
Yeah, but I'm looking at kind of on a broader scale where like we'll just keep it very simple. Like you make soldiers in a set and then you expect soldiers to be like a standard thing, and soldiers don't matter in standard. So you make the decision to go back to soldiers in year 3 of standard and finally boost that archetype up. That has to come from the design side, right?
Well, soldiers is a weird thing because presumably there's going to be enough small ones and enough reasonable payoffs.
Yeah. So have something more narrow than that, like toxic or something,
Again, small creature deck. It's like, yeah, hopefully there should be enough pieces here. But like, what would be a good like playable mechanic? Even stuff like the enchantments. They're like, all right, let's make a bunch of like 1 and 2 mana creatures. Like this is how we're going to do enchantments in this block or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess this only applies like really hard for the most parasitic things possible, right? Like things that only work with more of the exact same thing.
Right. And I don't know. I feel like even when
energy kind of comes to mind.
That's exactly where I was going to go. When design concepted energy, did they care whether or not that would show up in standard? I don't think they did. I think they were just like, here's some stuff that does some stuff with energy. And it's like, if Whirler Virtuoso was a 4-mana, like 3/3 or something, 3/4, like would they have cared? I don't think they would have cared at all. So like it is development's job to be like, all right, we need this to be a little bit more aggressively stated for limited and then also maybe constructed. Although Whirler Virtuoso is probably a bad example because I think that was the one where they're just like, oh, we didn't even try this in constructed.
Yeah.
But it's stuff like that where it's just like where did Attune with Ether get concepted, right? Do you think it was design or development?
Oh, that feels like design to me.
I kind of feel the opposite.
Really?
Yeah. I feel like Attune was exactly the sort of enabler that you would only come up with after playing games with like a 26 land energy deck that didn't have enough ways to generate energy. It was like, okay, how do we, get something a little better in here, a little bit more efficient, a little more like constructed focus. I think like that is likely where it came from to me. Like, I understand that, yes, design could just like nail that one or whatever. Like they could come up with it, but like the role that it feels so much more developer-y than
I think I probably bring a lot of bias into these questions with like how I do things in my own experience.
right, because you're designing, but you still have an eye for dev and your constructed formats and stuff.
Yes.
And I'm telling you that like I feel like you ask the vast majority of designers, at least, when I was around, and like a lot of those people are still around, it's like, do you know what decks are in standard? They would have no idea.
Interesting. Very interesting.
It was always the developers that were like going to F&M, not the designers.
Yep. Yeah, I could see that.
Anyway, talk more about these mechanics.
Yeah. So allow mechanics and archetypes to be built more effectively over time. There is sort of a shift that has changed how these things can be done in terms of getting away from the block model. But they achieved these things so successfully in the past. They had decks that like came out early and were only made with seeded cards later on. And I don't think it actually had anything to do with the length of standard. It had to do with the focus on standard, the design focus, where the entirety of what we're doing here is to like make a good standard format. And that was the core of design development, was make standard good. Modern will sort itself out. Legacy, we definitely don't give a shit about. Like, make standard good, make limited good. That's what we're here for. That's what we're doing on the dev side. And when that was the focus, you delivered on it. And so the idea that like both these archetypes being built over time, or the opportunity to create an environment where decks are more color and mechanic rather than mid-range, have anything to do with time, is a complete fallacy to me. They have to do with focus on the format that you care about. Like, what is your primary goal? What is your primary seller? In this case, it's still Commander, and that's not going to change. And if this sort of new setup doesn't come in with the goal of getting Magic cards back to the place where they don't do 20 things, where they don't just generate pieces of cardboard all over the place, then this is going to fail. It's not going to do anything. And it all comes back to the thing I've said a million times about specifically Fable of the Mirror Breaker. And I feel glad that we can bring it back around to that card specifically, because it is the poster child for a problem card in Standard, and deservedly so. But if you get rid of Fable of the Mirror Breaker, there's a million other Fables out there. Like, just the same exact card that is 10 pieces of value. Restoration of Aganjo can step up and be exactly that card. Wedding Announcement. Like, all these cards are just, there's so many pieces of cardboard in one that it doesn't actually matter which one of them is the focal point. This will always be it. You will always figure out how to generate the most cardboard if you keep designing cards in this fashion. It doesn't matter how much you want to see things like green-white toxic or blue-white soldiers. Things will always be mid-range if these are the type of cards you are designing, and it has nothing to do with how big the standard card pool is, how much time you have, how much you can reset an archetype and seed it for the future. This is all about where your focal point lies. And unless your focal point shifts back to standard, which is the only thing in this announcement that could have been like, oh shit, they get it and they're going to bring this back 100%, would have actually driven me to embrace their goals wholeheartedly, believe what they were doing. They have to say, we are now designing our flagship sets with a focal point on standard. If they did that, then I would believe in this goal. But everything else, it just feels like lip service to me. And a lot of it is rewriting past history, denying the fact that we used to be able to do these things with, color plus mechanic very well. We used to have aggro decks. We used to have pure control decks. Like, all these things existed, and it had nothing to do with the size of the card pool. It had to do with the cards that existed within that card pool.
Yes, but okay. I think you're kind of merging two separate points in a way that does make sense, admittedly, but like, the fact that Fable exists, I think that the optimistic version of me wants to look at it like, oh, there's like underlying tones here that, makes me think that they know that that's the problem or whatever, right? And I'm not convinced, but assuming that is the case, and there are fewer Fables and then again, like this announcement is kind of weird because I don't get why you wouldn't just rotate now and then be like, all right, it's like 3 years from here on out or something.
Mm-hmm.
But like if they recognize that was a problem. But anyway, the 2 points that I think that you're merging are the Fable problem and the being able to seed stuff. Like I agree that one supersedes the other, right? But that doesn't mean that there weren't struggles with the ability to seed things in the past. Like I said, something comes out in set 4 or whatever, or even like take this as an example. Cons of Tarkir
Yeah, I was going to ask, can you define the past? Like what era specifically are we talking about?
Yeah, so Cons of Tarkir is set 1, right? And when we were working on that set for, I would say, a majority of it, Teamer was probably the strongest wedge for standard, at least based on our perception, right? But then like some stuff gets nerfed, some Abzan stuff gets buffed, Anafenza and Siege Rhino switch places, Siege Rhino gets like this last minute buff. We missed some stuff in testing also. Like a lot of things had to like happen and change in order for things to like swap dramatically. And we certainly did not realize that at that point, like, okay, Abzan was the best by far, right? So then even after Abzan wins PT1, it's not until like set 3 or 4 where people are like, God damn it, we are sick of Abzan, right?
Yep.
And then at that point, if you're like in a development cycle for a set, you're like, oh, we need to like get something in there to help fix this or like bolster other archetypes or maybe bring back some of like the Teamer cards or like buff Jeskai a little bit better or whatever. I mean, like the plan for all of that was to basically have a lot of ETB tap lands and no 2-drops, which incentivized people to play 3-color stuff. And then as time went on, you introduce stronger like 2-colored and multicolored stuff so that the 3-color stuff slowly phases out. And then at the very tail end of that 8-set standard window, maybe you introduce some seeded stuff to revitalize the 3-color things. Just as like a last throwback, a last hurrah before they rotate out. And I think that plan was rad.
Yeah, it's cool.
But the way it played out was just like, Abzan was good the entire time, right? And that basically sucked. And if we wanted to fix that, it basically would have had no impact whatsoever, because not only are we not seeing that Abzan is still like the best deck in like set 5, set 6, where it's like at this point it should be kind of like phasing out or whatever. At that point, if we want to do anything about it, it's not going to actually get released into the wild until like Abzan is rotated out in the first place, you know? Yep. So like that is a real problem. It is definitely a real problem. And it's just like hand waving that problem away by saying like, oh, well, like you're still building, cards like Fable or whatever. It's like, it is true, but like it kind of undermines the fact that like it is a problem to begin with, right?
I agree it's a problem, but I don't actually think this solves that problem. And let me explain why. So the scenario you're describing,
it's better than nothing.
Maybe.
Which is a
I
low
don't even
bar.
know if that's, it could actually be worse than nothing. And let me explain how I think it could be worse than nothing. So we're in the scenario you're describing, and now you're in a 3-year standard. And now you do have that time window. You know Abzan has been a problem for this whole time. And you're able to seed for sets 8 and 9 really good either anti-Abzan stuff or, you make 2-color decks better and push them out. And that is now a reasonable timescale. Is that kind of like how you envision this would have played in that scenario, like giving that extra space?
Yeah, I mean, it gives you the opportunity to do stuff like that, but yep. I don't know. I mean, there's also, you have more to play with on the timeline where it's like, granted, Theros was the block beforehand and Theros mostly sucked ass. So it was like, assume that Theros was like a Ravnica or something, right? Like something cool that people actually liked. And it was like, oh, well, around this time, like we'll, drop in some seeds for that old stuff, right?
Mhm.
You have more to play with on that timeline as far as like ensuring that there is churn versus like, well, we overshot on this one archetype. And I mean, you could argue like Jeskai also was maybe overshot a little bit, at least compared to the other stuff, right? And it the way that we had it set up, it was just like if you overshoot, it's just such a disaster, right? And I think that a lot of that stuff you can also look at where it was like, Delver was so bad that eventually like Thragtusk came out and like Cavern of Souls and stuff like that, and it's just like those were a problem for 2 years because
Mhm.
they had to like look forward to solve that problem versus like constantly just buffing the backup stuff. It's like now you sort of have this buffer where if Cons is overpowered and you miss the mark on it, but you're planning on seeding stuff that came before it, you have an opportunity to sort of like play around the fact that you overshot it. Does that make sense?
It does, but
And again, this is all theoretical, right? Like
yeah.
I am also on your side where it's just like it feels kind of like bullshit to me. All of this does.
I think even if you achieve this theoretical goal, though, let's talk about the time frames we're covering here. Like in this scenario of Abzan being too good, you're asking me to play a standard format where Abzan is too good for 2 years, and then in the third year, there's a reprieve. If you nail it.
Yeah. So if Abzan is set 1, I don't want to address it in set 8, right? Like
Yes.
either want to ban something or hopefully by it being a wider timeline that on like set 5, set 6, you can do something that seeds a thing that came before it. Because
Yeah.
when it's 2-year rotation and set 1 has like the powerful thing, then you're just stuck with that. You have nothing to seed, right?
Yep. Maybe you can achieve that. But the reason it could theoretically be worse than nothing is if you try and achieve that and you're so focused on that goal, like we're going to do this, we have this coming, and it's going to fix this thing. Now you don't act on the problem, which is Abzan and has now dominated standard for 2 years, and you let that actually drive your player base away because you have this kind of grandiose plan where you think you are smart enough to solve it through this longer format, and you don't just ban something.
No.
And that's what probably needs to happen in that spot is you just ban something and sort the format out.
So that Abzan era was also kind of similar to this one, honestly, where Rakdos was the biggest thing. Like y'all remember Meat Hook Massacre? Like that was a card that was legal, right? And that got banned. And it didn't really do anything because in theory it was like, oh well, now like aggro's viable, and it's like that all the aggro cards suck.
Yeah.
So it just still doesn't matter, right? So yeah, they did address it in that fashion, and nothing happened, because they just needed to hit more things, right? And I think that Abzan format was pretty similar too. It's like, what do you ban? Like, obviously you could just ban Siege Rhino, and maybe that does it, but like, I wouldn't want to, like, Siege Rhino's iconic and well loved, even if you hate it, it's like you love to hate it, right? So I would want to attack that archetype in a different way, but maybe there just isn't. Maybe you just have to do that, or you have to go after multiple cards or whatever. I don't know. It's just all the cards along the curve were all just so good for that deck, right?
Yep. No, they really were. And that's sort of the problem you can run into. I think what it just points to is that this is not the answer. What you actually need is focus on standard, management of standard via probably more aggressive bans. If you're going to continue to make cards like Fable, Sheoldred, Reckoner, Bankbuster, like just get rid of them all. Who cares? Like get rid of them all, make a new format. And I think that's completely fine if you're going to get buy-in to standard as like a format people are participating in. There's certainly issues with like wild cards and the arena economy where this is kind of messed up. But I think that's why you saw Alchemy mentioned, and we always have a laugh at Alchemy. But
I just don't even want to talk about that aspect of things.
Okay, that's fine. We don't have to talk about it. But I do think there's a reason it's in this announcement. And it is the idea of like, let's set up Standard to be a unique thing. Basically, what I come back to is that these 3 points do not matter. What can actually save Standard is organized play focus, a reason for me to care about Standard via tournaments, a local scene, whatever, just general community investment in Standard, and actively manage Standard format that has a ban list that makes sense, that shows people care about the format, that are interested in keeping things fresh, that is interested in, preserving people's investments, interested in making more of the card pool viable. And then I think the final thing that ultimately all of this hinges on is, are you designing for Standard again? Are you making Magic with the idea that if we make a good Standard format and we make a good limited format, everything else can filter out from there? We don't need to hard target these, I almost said niche formats. They're not niche formats, like actually more popular formats, which is why they get hard targeted. But you believe that you have enough products to target those now. And that's where this announcement could be really exciting to me. If it came out and it said, we have incredible products for serving our Commander players. We have all these decks that we make on every set. We have infinite sets a year that are focused solely towards the Commander market. We have products to serve our modern players. We have this Lord of the Rings set coming. We have our Modern Horizons, Modern Masters. All these things are focused on modern players. Our core sets are going back to serving Standard players. That is what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be built around the idea of making the best Standard possible, making the best limited possible, and you'll find your modern and Commander cards elsewhere. Then I think you have a home run announcement that I could 100% buy into. Until you do that, though, it's just all lip service. And they won't do that because there's way too much money left on the table from doing that.
Yeah,
so they'll never do it.
I do agree with that. I do want to be clear that I do think that they have been still designing sets with Standard in mind, but you are right in that there are other goals that have superseded that, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can't look at the number of legends that are presently legal in Standard and say that there's not a shift.
There is literally a Legends tribal deck.
Yep.
So yeah. Oh, that's weird. I wonder why that happened right now. I do want to say that like all the stuff that I'm talking about, like it's kind of weird where I feel like I come across as like that is what I want the plan to be or whatever. And I actually don't want that to be the plan where it's like, oh yeah, if we just blow it, we'll fix it with like future stuff or whatever, because the lag time on that is so huge. And ideally the plan is that like you don't blow it in the first place, or there are stopgaps already in place. And trying to like hard puppeteer what sort of like decks and archetypes and like cards people are going to be playing with is just a bad idea, because it doesn't work.
No, I agree 100%.
And dude, I was so dumb back in 2013 when I worked there, right? But this is one thing that I think I got right, which was all I really wanted to do was to ensure that Standard had a relatively flat power level and to make sure that there was like a bunch of fun stuff to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then
make
hopefully
a sandbox for people to play in.
Yeah, hopefully that just sorts itself out. And if things happen where there is like a Fable of the Mirror Breaker, or there is a color combination where it has the best disruption, removal, life gain, threats, top end, it's like, well, yeah, then we blew it in that aspect, right? And hopefully that is just not the case. But like, if it is, you need more tools to deal with that. And I think back then they were sort of loath to ban something in Standard.
100%.
And I probably was too, honestly.
I think so. I think that's just how we approach things for a long time. And
now I'm just like, let it rip.
Yeah.
Get it out.
I do think there was a period where the game was much better for it, where like the entire financial market was being driven by Standard. There was a lot of risk in banning Standard cards. And like Jace the Mind Sculptor was $100 Standard card because it was a Standard card. That's it. That's why it cost that much.
Well,
and in that,
to be fair, there weren't a lot of other places you could play it.
Right. But in that era, it was a huge, huge risk to go ahead and ban a card like that when you basically asked your players to, shell out however many dollars for 4 Jaces, and that's how you participated in Standard. Yeah, I would have been real pissed back then. I mean, I wouldn't have been, but like I would have understood people who were real pissed back then. And I do think it was something you had to consider. I just don't think it's the case anymore. And you need to see that as a blessing and start using it as such.
So, Meat Hook Massacre topped out at around, I guess there was like a brief window where it was pushing towards 80, but like about 70 was where it was at, right?
Yep.
It was not necessarily being driven by Standard. Certainly there was some amount of that because it gets banned. Now it's simply $40 instead of 70. But like that is way less of a hit than the situation you're talking about with Jace, where it's like, well, if Jace goes from like, Standard is one of the only formats and you can't play it anywhere else and it gets banned and it becomes like a $5 card from a $100 card, that sucks.
Which it might have done, honestly.
Maybe. I mean, it might have, like, I'm sure we could find an analog that is not specifically Jace the Mind Sculptor, because like at that point the card was iconic and would have retained at least some value. But like certainly, Jace was very low for a very long time, where it was like not very good in Legacy, was banned in Modern, et cetera, right?
Yeah, it was creeping down for sure.
But like
maybe still is.
Yeah, I mean, Shieldred is in kind of a similar spot where it's like 70, and it's like, let's say that gets banned in Standard or whatever. It's like it's really not that big a deal.
I just don't think it matters that much. Yeah.
It's not. And for stuff like Bankbuster, I mean, Bankbuster's like $4. Again, not that big of a deal.
There's 400 versions of it, right? So you can always buy the cheapest version. And that is good, by the way. Like one of the best things for Standard is that there are 4 million versions of every card. And you should be able to buy the cheapest version of a card and put together a Standard deck very cheaply if you get rid of some of these outliers. And to be honest with you, I actually think Shieldred's price is more of a reason to ban the card as it exists right now than a reason not to ban it. I think things have flipped that much that you actually do not want that card to be part of your Standard environment, in part because of its cost.
It's really bad for new players coming in, or I mean, it's really good for new players coming in if like, there's not a $70 like, oh, you kind of have to have this card to play sort of thing. But like for all the people who have already bought in, it certainly sucks there. So it's, I mean, in a longer term, certainly over the course of 3 years, that may be a correct move, but it's also kind of weird where it's like, anytime we get a card that is expensive in Standard, we got to ban it or whatever. It's like, I don't think that's a great place to be either.
Yeah. What you hope for and what has very much manifested is that the cards that are, because this isn't like, this is a zero-sum game, right? Like cards have to carry the weight of the cost of a booster pack, and it's always going to be assigned across the set to various things. The best case scenario for Standard is that your commander cards are like the $40 and $50 cards, and they carry a huge amount of the value of a booster pack, and then all the Standard stuff actually becomes much, much cheaper.
Yeah. And, but when you have the stuff that has crossover, then it's like, this is not great.
Yeah, that's danger. But that goes back to the idea of like, if you were just designing these core sets with mostly Standard cards, there should be less crossover. And then you start to get to the question like, well, who wants these cards then? And that is hard to answer. That is the problem, is that you have to have successfully built out your Standard ecosystem again before you actually have somebody who wants to buy a product that is shifted away from Modern, from Commander, and focused back on Standard. Like the scenario I'm describing is just a complete all-time low seller. And like I said, I don't think there's any chance Wizards will ever do that. So
yeah. I mean, Meat Hook is kind of the primary example of this, where it's just, I mean, I guess Shieldred's another one where it's very, very aggressively costed for what is very clearly a cool commander effect and like something people will latch onto. And it's like, maybe those should not explicitly be the same thing, or like maybe those should just not be the mythic rares.
Yep. I think that's a good discussion to have too. What is supposed to be a mythic and what's supposed to be a plain old rare?
Like,
it's a really interesting question.
Shieldred, okay, it's a Praetor, they're all going to be mythics, whatever, but it's like maybe that text should just not be on the Shieldred, Maybe it should be on something else. Like there's like the Esper card that did something similar that was like an uncommon. Obviously, it's like way worse rate or whatever, but it's like there's no reason it has to be on a mythic rare. Like
no, you're right. If this card was just a rare and it wasn't a Praetor, it would be exactly the same in the standard context. Not exactly the same. There are very small differences, but close enough anyway. And you get to make your staple card that doesn't cost $1 billion.
Yeah, but then there are also some goals where it's like, well, if we're going to make this set with these characters, ideally we would like some of them to show up. You know, it is cool to have like a story character be in a headlining deck or whatever. And
yeah, but they got away from that, right? Like they've actively stated, and this is the problem when you only give a few bits and pieces.
I'm just saying it is a good thing because like now Shieldred is a character that people will remember based on like the power level of the cards. It's very similar to like Jace the Mind Sculptor, right? It's pros and cons that come along with it for sure. But whenever it does happen, I think it is like there are very positive aspects I can see.
I don't know the answer to that question. I know my personal answer, and I'm trying to divorce myself from my personal answer and just think of the broader answer. My personal answer is that it does not matter whatsoever. And I think the vast majority of players, it does not matter whatsoever. When it comes to something like a Praetor, with Jace, I think it's a little different because it's like a headline named character. I don't think Shieldred has that same level of resonance.
No, I know.
That could just be me.
But I'm saying like it allows Shieldred to punch up a little bit. To the point where it's like, you might not, 10 years from now, you might not remember any of the Praetors, but you'll remember Shieldred, right?
Maybe. I remember Vorinclex because I don't know how to pronounce his name. That's the one that
was correct. That was correct. You nailed it.
Got it this time.
You used to say Vorniclex.
Vorniclex, yes. That's what I said for a very long time.
We had a real Bernstein Bear situation on our hand where you're like, what?
Yes.
Did they go back and unprint like all the Vorniclexes?
I almost wrote the angry email to Wizards.
Oh, yeah. You're just like about to hit send on the tweet or whatever. And then you're like, wait, I should double check.
Let's double check this one. Yeah.
Anyway, man, sandbox, transparency, actually meaning what they say. Like, it's just one of those things where it's like, do they actually care? Because it's so strange to me where, suddenly, like, even in that article, like Aaron had some tweet from November of 2022 where it's like, why don't y'all play standard anymore? It's like, because y'all don't do shit with it. Yeah. You don't run any events in it.
We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas.
Yeah, you don't ban things that are very obviously problematic. Like, you don't do anything to make it so that this format matters. Why the hell would I play this? Right? And then they're just like, oh man, like why don't people like standard or whatever? It's like, granted that tweet was from a while ago. So if that was kind of like when they started thinking about it, like, okay, yeah, it took a while to come up with a plan. And
it does, by the way. Like, yeah.
Like you're changing a lot of how stuff works in house. And also in terms of the development side of things, like it's way harder to keep track of like a 12 set format than an 8 set format and like develop for that thing. Like they're developing for Modern Horizons, for example, was hard as hell because there are just a ton of cards and it was more cards in the format meant that there were like more decks that needed to be tested and everything, right? Mm-hmm. More decks that needed to be built and just like physically carried around and like it does add a lot. You're adding another 33% or whatever into the thing. Or I guess 50%. I don't know. Like it's you have to take the steps to like actually okay that and get it push through and everything. Yep. And that does
make
take
sure
time.
Your teams are strong and well staffed. Like all that stuff matters a lot.
Right. So yeah, maybe it did take like, 6-7 months or whatever to like get an actual plan into place or whatever. But I don't know. I feel like they should have been able to know that this was a problem and know some of the reasons why, but like obviously I don't know exactly like where their head is at, like what sort of things that they're focused on. Like I could totally understand them being focused on like other stuff, and then you just kind of wake up one day and you're like, oh wait, like we weren't
Yeah.
actually focusing on this thing, and like now we realize it's a problem. Oh shit.
Well, let's not forget too that they have to deal with the corporate structure. So like if there's someone in charge who like you can't produce the right PowerPoint presentation to convince them that focusing on standard is a good idea, and they're just like, no, we're not going to do this anymore. That's it. You like you can't fight against that in a lot of ways. You have to put together your case. You have to put together an evidence-based case, and something like this tweet can very much be the foundation of an evidence-based case to go ahead and present
No,
up
that's
the ladder.
fair.
And
That's fair.
yeah, there's so many complications with making magic that I do not envy for all these folks. And I hope I still am able to express some appreciation and just gratitude for what they do. I don't think it's easy, even if I complain a lot. So I hope that shines through still.
I mean, again, a lot of our reviews for like the sets themselves are glowing.
They're pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, man. Like the last couple of years, especially of sets and cards, like the cards are cool. They are exciting, and certainly they have like a lot more text, and maybe there are some outlier problems and everything, and maybe the focus on commander or whatever is not ideal like it is for their bottom line, but is not ideal for us as people who want to have sets for like competitive tournament formats or whatever. And there's just like a lot of competing goals in place now, and
yes, there is.
It didn't used to be like that. But like a lot of that is like not the designers or developers' faults, and like they're doing a bang up job despite all that stuff. So yeah.
No, it's a hard context to work under. Like it used to be very easy for me to think about how to fix these problems. And, if you followed my writing over the years, you'd see I put forth a lot of, well, why don't we try this, this, and this? It is not easy for me to suggest those things anymore because I'm starting to just realize how complicated their internal structures are,
right,
and how complicated their competing goals are. And it's not as clean as do one thing or another. It's just you have to balance all of this stuff at the same time. And I am not at all envious of it.
Yeah. Capitalism.
It'll get you every time.
All right. So end of the day, what do we want from this? What do we like ideally want to see from this?
It's just got to be it's got to be wholesale buy-in. It's got to be actual wanting to raise standard to the level of a flagship format once more. And I think ultimately it's going to have to be a question of, are you willing to sacrifice $1 or $2 in the short term? Like I do think you have to turn the way you're designing cards a little bit to be more focused on a standard environment if you want standard to succeed. And that maybe makes your set less popular with the commander players. I don't even know if that's true though, man. Like it just feels like an unstoppable juggernaut, and like commander players just want more cards. They're just like more, and they don't care if like 250 of the 300 cards are pointed towards them. Like I think if you just give them 50, they can also be satisfied with that.
I kind of feel like the opposite might be true too, where when they are very heavy-handedly trying to design cards for commander, that does not feel good. Like commander as a format existed and like flourished and thrived for many, many years when it was a format that was played with cards that were not designed for it. Like people found like these hidden gems that ended up being good, like in Commander, and they loved that aspect about it. But then when things start getting released where it's like very clearly just the words on it are like, put me in
Commander.
your deck or your deck is bad or whatever. It's like, that's not as cool.
Yeah. And certainly there are members of that community, which you and I are very distant from, but I do get some bleed in. There's certainly people in that community who feel underserved, who feel frustrated with the pace of things. And
Again,
then you go
it's
back.
a sandbox thing, right? It's like, don't tell me what to do. Like, just make cool shit and I'll figure it out.
Yep. But you go back to the dollars and they're selling the products to somebody. And I still continue to make the same argument that I know what they're doing is in some ways successful. But was Magic always destined to be a success in this era? Is it actually the shift that has made them this infinite money? And in terms of making more products, yes, you found like the time when appetite was at its absolute apex and you made as many products as you possibly can. And that's always going to make you more money. But I'm just talking about terms of popularity and how many players there were.
Right.
If they just continued down the same path and the cultural zeitgeist shifted a little bit towards gaming and towards these more quote unquote nerdy pursuits and, everything that's gone on in the world, including pandemics and the desire to like bond with people again and share a table again. If all that happens in the absence of this just hard drive towards Commander and targeting everyone with universes beyond, like, does Magic still grow exponentially? And in my heart, I believe the answer is yes. But that's always just going to be conjecture, and I have no way to prove that.
Yeah.
So.
And it's tough too, because you need a format in place, like a way to play the game that serves someone with a more like casual attitude or appetite, right? And it just so happened that Commander was the thing that existed at that time that served that player base, and then WotC just got to lean into that.
Yeah.
And it like I agree with you that it didn't necessarily have to be Commander. It could have been something else, but like that's just the way it played out. And then at that point, like, yeah, you sell more products to those people because you're just getting like this massive influx of new players and players who maybe were lapsed, or players who are now like willing to just like double or triple down on how much they spend on Magic, because it just ends up becoming such a big and important part of their life and everything. So it didn't
also
have
the
to
right
be
people ended up with disposable income too. Like that's a huge part of it. Like the industries that succeeded over the last 10 years have very much been congruent with gamers, and that kind of disposable income, the collecting, all of that stuff has just formed a perfect storm for Magic.
Yeah, also very true. But, again, like working professionals do not necessarily have like the drive or the time to go compete in Grand Prix or whatever. So it did have to be a casual thing, right? Something with less of a buy-in, possibly. So
yeah.
I don't know. Like if like that sort of thing didn't exist, or they weren't willing to focus on it as more, like would it have caught on as much? Like would you have like Post Malone playing Magic or whatever and like loving it? Like I don't know.
Also don't know. But like the seed was there, right? Like the dude talked about playing in his youth, so obviously there was something.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And like it sort of goes hand in hand with the revitalization of like board games and stuff like that too, where it's like what you want a tabletop thing to do. It's like, this is kind of like the OG, like Magic, D&D, whatever, like all of these things were around. You just have to find a way to be able to engage under the limitations that you have. And I do think in a lot of instances, like Magic as strictly a competitive endeavor would have not served those people.
Yeah.
So
fair point.
Whatever. Doesn't matter. I want them to just ban shit more. And
yes,
I do want them to focus on it, as you've said, but I also feel like I might be more in the camp of they have been more so than you are. And I think that they've just been trying to serve goals that are sometimes competing with each other, which is obviously not fun and very difficult, but they've been, doing their best or whatever. And I do think that like those goals can exist. They can't both be number one. There has to be some compromise there. Absolutely. And I don't know, maybe there is a world in which stuff like Meat Hook Massacre, if you decide like, hey, this would be a fun thing for Commander and this is the sort of like sweeper effect that we want in Standard, well, it's like maybe, this should not be the case. Like if this is the power level that we want for Commander, but maybe this is not the power level we want for Standard, then one of them has to go, or like there are just two versions. Like put the 3 casting cost one in the standard set and the 2 casting cost one in the commander deck. I don't care, you know?
Yep. Yeah, I would be looking at non-traditional solutions at this point for sure.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
Exactly. And there are just a lot of knobs always, you know, there are definitely things that you can do when you are making products directly that serve commander audiences. Certainly you can do stuff like that. Obviously you need to make standard sets appealing for commander players because they will certainly buy cards, and you can do that in ways where you make like some of the funky cards that are good in commander, just like put them in the standard set instead of the commander deck, maybe, you know, like that is also a thing you can do. Like it does look kind of ugly where it's like, what the hell is this thing doing here, you know, but it does
have a commander slot in standard things where like they
sure
have a unique border and they're not legal in standard and they stand out as such, but every pack gets one commander slot card or something.
Yeah, I think that's completely fine. Just like make a list that is focused more towards commander or something. That'd be cool with me. I don't like the idea of putting cards in standard boosters that are not legal in standard, but clearly they have
already done that.
Yeah, completely just disregarded that. So whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that this stuff is doable. I think that they certainly have the power to revitalize standard. I don't know that this solves all their problems, and I'm also, I don't know, skeptical of like the timing and the messaging and whether or not they will be transparent and do the things that it takes to actually make this work. I think there would be a massive amount of confidence gained when they announce that they're like banning Fable and whatever else, you know?
Yeah, the simplest and like the most easy to enact advice I could give is just go ban a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, and keep doing it. That I think that's the easiest thing. And
prove that you mean it.
Be transparent, be clear, be direct, discuss your internal processes for determining whether or not you would ban something, talk about potential for unbanning, like all of it. Just lay out as much as you possibly can to your standard player base. That is how you win. I'm telling you from experience, we've been through this. We built that kind of trust from our player base by doing exactly that. And
you got to do it from day one though. And I think the proof exists in how we even approach this announcement, where we're automatically approaching it with skepticism.
Yep.
Because they have a bad track record. So at that point,
no, you have to rebuild your relationships for sure.
Exactly. So, I mean, you could put in the work to try and do that, which may not even be a certainty, right? And if you task that job out to someone, like it's going to take years, right? What are the odds that that person stays with you for years and everything? And I think that that's part of it too. It's just like
that's just, it's the same question. It's the same level of commitment. Like, do you pay someone enough that they'll stay with you? Do you treat someone well enough that they'll stay with you? Like, it's the same level of commitment.
We know the answers to those questions. The answer is no.
Yeah.
So, you know, as soon as you find a better offer from like Bungie or Riot or whatever, like you're gone. And that's the best way to also like get a raise at Wizards, is to get hired by a AAA studio and then come back demanding more money.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I don't work at Wizards, I think, doesn't have a whole lot to do with my capacity or at least occasional willingness on their part to employ me. It has a lot more to do with the level of commitment they show to their employees. So.
Yeah. So I don't know. I see their hesitancy, but I also think that they could just be like way more aggressive in, like, they have more power than I think that they realize as far as controlling the narrative is concerned.
Maybe a good way of putting it.
And I think at this point they've basically just given up. It's just like, it's impossible. We can't beat the Twitter mob. And it's like, I do think you can. It's going to take some work. And especially if you go at it from kind of like, you know, this milquetoast sort of way or whatever, it's going to take an even longer time or whatever.
Yeah.
But you could just kind of like be an asshole about it and just have a like take no shit kind of attitude. And I think that would get you pretty far. as long as like you are actually being transparent. Like people would figure that out very quickly. You just can't let yourself get like walked all over, you know?
I think so. That's a lot to ask from an individual employee. So
no, it is, because like they just have to show up to work every day like willing to fight, right? And I it's a big ask, for like 70K a year or whatever. It's like, oh god, do I really want to go to battle with Twitter every single day?
I would not do it for 70K a year, that's for sure.
Yeah, while living in Seattle also,
Yep.
like you can live in Kent if you want, but like that's also not a good thing.
Enjoy your 2-hour commute.
Yeah. Anyway, closing thoughts. Anything else?
No closing thoughts. I wish them the best. I hope it goes well. I would like a standard that I could care about.
Me too, man. Because I don't know, that was effectively like where we drove the show, right? Yep. Like the word arena is literally in the name, and it has been a joke for so long.
They got us.
Yep,
they got us. They
got us good. Rebrand coming at you soon. Maybe not.
Any minute now.
Maybe not very soon, but yeah, dude, I'm right there with you. I want this to work. I want standard to be good. I think Magic needs more than 2 formats, and I think it does need one with a lower buy-in. I think that maybe 3 years, if they handle it well, gives players some confidence that their purchase will carry them a little bit longer. I know that being more willing to ban things kind of like throws a wrench into that, but I'm telling you, like if people are buying into having like a full standard collection or whatever, banning a Fable and unbanning like 50 cards will feel good, not bad to them.
Oh, just real quick too. I think there is a very big difference between banning cards and banning decks. And for a long time,
yes,
they
absolutely.
banned decks, and they need to get better at banning cards instead.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, granted, I think that's what the meat hook ban was.
Yeah, it was.
To do, but
it wasn't quite there. It's hard. It's really hard to do.
Right. But yeah, I mean, at that point, it's like, okay, well, also like ban Fable, and you still have the majority of your investment, right? Like the remaining Rakdos cards are still like a couple $100, right? It's not like it becomes bad or anything either. So whatever, please work. Please. I like being able to cover standard, because more happens in standard, it seems like, than in, Pioneer and Modern.
Yeah, standard could change week to week.
Yeah, or at least just give us a third format to work with. Then we can just like rotate and everything. I think that all of this would do a lot of good, but also like hold standard tournaments. Like what the hell?
Yeah, I don't know if that's number 1 or number 2, but they're right up there for sure.
It is up there. All right, that's it. I'm done. I hope this did not come across as like too negative or whatever. Again, I think that if you kind of like zoom out, look at it from the bigger picture of what we're saying and how we're feeling, it's like, we do love Magic. We are optimistic about the future and everything. And just hope that, focus in on like the minutia of like us honing in on like some negative point or whatever, because that's not, I don't want you to come here and have like a bad time or like leave in a bad mood. That's not my goal. So
yeah, I recommend taking painkillers before you listen to this podcast. You'll be in a great spot.
Or taking a nap after, probably, sleep it off.
Yeah, that'll work.
Game.
Good luck.